I spent 3 hours cooking for my mother's birthday, and she laughed in my face. Hi, I'm Caitlin, and I'm 34 years old. I've always had a complicated relationship with my mother. Growing up, nothing I did was ever quite good enough. My grades were fine, but could be better. My clothes were acceptable, but not stylish. My choices were tolerable, but never celebrated. Over the years, I learned to shrink myself around her, to expect the small criticisms that came wrapped in tight smiles. I thought I had made peace with it. My mother turned 62 this past spring, and I wanted to do something meaningful. I decided to cook her an entire birthday dinner from scratch. It wasn't a casual decision. I spent weeks researching recipes, testing dishes, and practicing until my hands knew the movements by heart. I wanted her to see me, really see me, through the effort I was putting in. I thought maybe food could say what my words never could. The morning of her birthday, I arrived at her house early. I carried grocery bags filled with fresh ingredients and a heart full of cautious hope. My mother watched me unload everything onto the counter with a raised eyebrow. She didn't offer to help. She just poured herself coffee and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. I told myself it was fine. She didn't need to help. This was my gift to her. I started with the appetizers: bruschetta with heirloom tomatoes, a spinach dip from scratch, and stuffed mushrooms that took me 40 minutes to prepare. My mother glanced up occasionally, making small comments. She said the tomatoes looked uneven. She wondered aloud if the mushrooms would be too salty. Each observation landed like a tiny stone against my ribs. I smiled and kept working, reminding myself that this was just how she communicated. By midday, the main course was coming together. I was making her favorite: roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes and glazed carrots. The kitchen smelled incredible. I felt proud of what I was creating. But when I asked my mother to taste the sauce, she wrinkled her nose and said it needed more salt. Then she added that her own mother made it differently. I thanked her for the feedback and turned back to the stove quietly. The real blow came when I set everything on the table. I had arranged the plates carefully, garnished with fresh herbs, and lit candles to make the dining room feel warm and special. My mother sat down, looked at everything, and laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was dismissive, almost mocking. She said it looked like something from a cooking show that was trying too hard. My chest tightened. I didn't respond immediately. She kept going. She said home cooking shouldn't look like a performance. She said I was always doing too much, always seeking approval. The words cut deeper than she probably intended. Or maybe she intended exactly that sharpness. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that the room suddenly felt very small, and the beautiful dinner I had made looked foolish through her eyes. I sat down slowly. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I had learned long ago that arguing with my mother only made things worse. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. It was something I had written the night before, just in case. I hadn't been sure if I would give it to her, but in that moment, I knew it was time. I slid the envelope across the table without a word. She looked at me, confused. Inside was a handwritten note. I had spent hours choosing every word carefully. The note wasn't angry. It wasn't a list of grievances. It was something quieter, something I had never had the courage to say out loud. I watched my mother unfold the paper and begin to read. Her expression shifted slowly, like clouds moving across the sun. For the first time in years, I saw something I didn't recognize on her face. The note explained that every dish I made that day came from Grandma Elaine's recipes. My grandmother passed away when I was 19, and I had kept her handwritten recipe cards in a box for years. I told my mother that cooking those recipes made me feel close to Grandma again. I told her I had hoped the meal would remind her of her own mother, who she rarely talked about. The silence in the room grew heavy. My mother set the note down on the table. Her hands were trembling slightly. She didn't look at me right away. Instead, she stared at the plates of food as if seeing them for the first time. I could see her processing, making connections she hadn't considered. Grandma Elaine had died suddenly, and my mother had never fully grieved. She threw herself into work and routine instead. I hadn't realized how deep that wound still ran. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet. She didn't apologize with words. My mother has never been good at apologies. But she reached across the table and touched my hand. It was brief, almost hesitant, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be tender. In that small gesture, I felt something shift between us. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't healing, but it was a beginning. We ate the meal in near silence. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that settles over people who have just shared something true. My mother finished every bite on her plate. She even asked for seconds of the carrots. I didn't point it out. I didn't need to. Sometimes acknowledgement comes in forms you don't expect. Sometimes a clean plate says what a person can't. After dinner, she asked me where I had kept Grandma's recipe cards all these years. I told her they were in a small wooden box in my apartment closet. She nodded slowly and asked if she could see them sometime. It was such a simple request, but it carried weight I hadn't anticipated. I said yes, of course. I told her she could come over anytime she wanted. Her eyes softened just a little more. That night, as I packed up the leftovers, my mother did something unusual. She helped. She stood beside me at the sink and dried the dishes I washed. We didn't talk much, but there was a rhythm to our movements that felt unfamiliar and comforting. I couldn't remember the last time we had stood side by side like that. It felt like a language we had both forgotten how to speak. Before I left, she hugged me. It was quick and slightly awkward, the way her hugs have always been. But she held on just a second longer than usual. She said, "Thank you. Not for the dinner, but for the note." She said no one had talked to her about her mother in years. She said she hadn't realized how much she had missed hearing Grandma's name spoken with love. I nodded and said goodnight. Driving home, I thought about all the years I had spent wanting my mother to see me. I realized that night wasn't just about being seen. It was about seeing her too. Understanding that her sharpness came from grief she never processed. Understanding that her criticism was often a shield. It didn't excuse everything, but it softened the edges of old wounds. I felt lighter than I had in a long time. A few weeks later, she came to my apartment to look at the recipe cards. We sat on my couch together, going through them one by one. She told me stories I had never heard. About Grandma's kitchen, about holidays from her childhood, about the arguments and the laughter. I listened without interrupting. It was the most open she had ever been with me. It felt like meeting a version of my mother I hadn't known existed. I still cook from Grandma's recipes. Sometimes I invite my mother over, and she helps now. She's learning to offer compliments instead of corrections. It doesn't come naturally to her, and she still slips sometimes. But I notice the effort. I appreciate the trying. Relationships don't heal overnight. They heal in small, repeated gestures, in shared meals, in handwritten notes that finally say the quiet truth. We're finding our way slowly. I don't know what the future holds for us. I can't promise we won't have more difficult moments, more misunderstandings, more hurt. But I know now that connection is possible, even when it feels unreachable. That birthday dinner changed something between us. It didn't fix everything, but it opened a door. And sometimes, that's all you really need. Just an open door and the courage to walk through it together. 3 months had passed since that birthday dinner. My mother and I had fallen into a new rhythm, something tentative but real. She came to my apartment every other Sunday, and we cooked together from Grandma Elaine's recipe cards. It wasn't always easy. Old habits crept in sometimes. But we were trying, and that mattered more than perfection. I started to believe that maybe we could build something lasting after all. Then my mother called on a Tuesday evening, which was unusual. She never called during the week unless something was wrong. Her voice sounded different, smaller, somehow. She told me she had been cleaning out her attic and found a box she had forgotten about. It belonged to Grandma Elaine. She said there were things inside that I needed to see. I told her I would come over the next morning. I barely slept that night. My mind kept circling around what could be in that box. Letters? Photographs? More recipes? I realized how little I actually knew about my grandmother's life before she became a grandmother. She had always just been grandma to me, warm, steady, smelling of vanilla and lavender. I never thought to ask about who she was before that. Now I wished I had asked sooner. When I arrived at my mother's house, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the box already open. It was a simple cardboard box, worn at the edges and slightly dusty. She looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. There was nervousness there, maybe even fear. She gestured for me to sit down. I pulled out a chair and waited for her to speak first. Inside the box were dozens of letters, all addressed to my grandmother. The return address was from someone named Ruth Patterson. I didn't recognize the name. My mother explained quietly that Ruth was Grandma Elaine's younger sister. I stared at her, confused. I had never heard of a sister. My mother nodded slowly and said that was exactly the problem. Grandma never spoke of Ruth, not once in her entire life. My mother had read a few of the letters already. She said they dated back over 40 years. Ruth had written consistently, at least once a month, but it seemed like Grandma Elaine never responded. The letters were filled with apologies, with pleas for forgiveness, with memories of their childhood together. Ruth kept writing even when she received no reply. The devotion in those letters was heartbreaking. I picked one up carefully. The letter in my hand was from 1986. Ruth wrote about missing her sister at Christmas. She described the snow falling outside her window in Minnesota and how it reminded her of the winters they spent as children. She mentioned a fight they had, though she didn't explain what it was about. She asked, again, if Elaine could ever forgive her. The words were faded but still legible, and I could feel the longing in every sentence. I looked at my mother and asked if she knew what the fight was about. She shook her head. She said Grandma never mentioned Ruth, and whenever anyone asked about siblings, she changed the subject quickly. My mother had assumed Grandma was an only child. Finding out there was a sister, and that they had been estranged for decades, felt like discovering a hidden room in a house you thought you knew completely. It unsettled us both. We spent the next hour reading letters together. Ruth's life unfolded in fragments: a marriage, 2 children, a job as a school teacher, the death of her husband in 2003. She kept writing through all of it, updating Grandma on milestones and ordinary days alike. She never stopped hoping for reconciliation, and Grandma, as far as we could tell, never acknowledged a single letter. The silence seemed impossibly cruel. Near the bottom of the box, we found something different. It was a letter written in Grandma Elaine's handwriting, addressed to Ruth but never sent. The envelope was sealed. My mother held it in her hands, trembling slightly. She asked me if we should open it. I hesitated. It felt like trespassing on something deeply private. But it also felt necessary, like the only way to understand what had really happened between them. My mother opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single page, written in Grandma's familiar cursive. The letter was dated 2010, just 2 years before she died. She wrote that she had wanted to respond for years, but didn't know how. She admitted that the silence had become its own prison. She said she was ashamed, not of Ruth, but of herself. She had let pride and stubbornness steal decades from them both. Grandma wrote about the original fight. It was about their father's funeral in 1972. Ruth had said something that Elaine took as an insult. Looking back, Grandma admitted she probably overreacted. But at the time, the wound felt too deep to forgive. So she stopped speaking to Ruth entirely. She thought the silence would be temporary. But then years passed, and reaching out became harder instead of easier. Eventually, she convinced herself it was too late. The letter ended with 3 sentences that made my mother cry. Grandma wrote that she loved Ruth and always had. She said she was sorry for the wasted years, and she asked Ruth to forgive her if she ever found the courage to send the letter. But she never did. She died with the apology still sealed in an envelope, hidden in a box in the attic. The weight of that silence filled the kitchen. My mother wiped her eyes and asked what we should do. I didn't have an immediate answer. Ruth might still be alive, somewhere in Minnesota, still waiting for a response that never came. The thought of her hoping all those years, only to be met with permanent silence, made my chest ache. I told my mother that maybe we could find Ruth. Maybe we could deliver Grandma's letter ourselves, even if it was years too late. She looked at me like I had suggested something impossible. Then her expression softened. She said it was a crazy idea, but maybe that's exactly what made it right. Grandma never found the courage to reach out. Maybe we could do it for her. Maybe we could close the loop she left open. It wouldn't fix everything, but it might bring some peace. I nodded and said we should at least try. That night, I searched online for Ruth Patterson in Minnesota. There were several results, but one seemed promising. A Ruth Patterson in Duluth, age 81, listed in a public directory. The age matched what it should be based on the letters. My heart beat faster as I stared at the screen. I wrote down the address and phone number. I didn't call yet. Some things require more preparation than a spontaneous phone call. I called my mother the next morning and told her what I found. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she wanted to go with me. She wanted to meet her aunt, the woman her mother had erased from their family history. I could hear the mix of fear and hope in her voice. I told her we would do this together. We would bring Grandma's letter and see if Ruth still had room in her heart for forgiveness. We decided to write Ruth a letter first, introducing ourselves and explaining what we had found. It felt more respectful than showing up unannounced. I spent 3 evenings drafting and revising, trying to find the right words. I explained who we were, what we discovered, and that we had something of Grandma's that belonged to Ruth. I asked if she would be willing to meet us. Then I sealed the envelope and mailed it. The waiting was harder than I expected. Every day I checked my mailbox with a mix of hope and dread. My mother called me constantly, asking if I had heard anything. 2 weeks passed with no response. I started to wonder if we had the wrong Ruth, or if she had moved, or if she simply didn't want to reopen old wounds. I tried to prepare myself for the possibility that this story might not have a neat ending. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a letter arrived. The return address was from Duluth, Minnesota. My hands shook as I opened it. Ruth's handwriting was shaky but legible. She said she had cried for 2 days after receiving our letter. She said she never stopped hoping Elaine would reach out. And now, even though Elaine was gone, she wanted to meet us. She wanted to finally know her sister's daughter and granddaughter. My mother and I booked flights to Minnesota for the following weekend. It felt surreal, making travel plans to meet a great-aunt I never knew existed. I kept rereading Ruth's letter, searching for clues about who she was. Her words were warm but careful, like someone who had learned not to expect too much. I wondered if decades of silence had taught her to guard her heart. I hoped we wouldn't disappoint her. The night before our flight, my mother called me. Her voice was unsteady. She confessed she was terrified. What if Ruth blamed her for Grandma's silence? What if meeting us reopened wounds that had finally started to heal? I understood her fear because I felt it too, but I reminded her that Ruth had invited us. She wanted this connection. Sometimes courage means showing up even when you're afraid. We landed in Duluth on a gray Saturday morning. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and clean with the smell of pine trees. My mother clutched her purse tightly as we walked through the small airport. Inside her bag was Grandma Elaine's unsent letter, still in its original envelope. We hadn't decided exactly when to give it to Ruth. Some things, I figured, would become clear in the moment. Ruth lived in a modest house on a quiet street lined with bare trees. The neighborhood felt peaceful, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and waved from porches. We parked in front of her house and sat in the rental car for a full minute, neither of us moving. My mother took a deep breath. I reached over and squeezed her hand. Then we opened the doors and walked toward the front steps. Before we could knock, the door opened. Ruth stood in the doorway, smaller than I had imagined, with white hair pinned back and eyes that looked exactly like Grandma Elaine's. The resemblance made my breath catch. She studied us for a moment, her expression soft and searching. Then she smiled, and it was like watching the sun break through clouds. She said our names like she had been practicing them for weeks. She invited us inside, and the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. The living room was filled with photographs, children, grandchildren, landscapes from places I didn't recognize. Ruth moved slowly but steadily, guiding us to a worn couch covered with quilted blankets. She sat across from us in a rocking chair and folded her hands in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt sacred. Ruth broke the quiet first. She said she had imagined this moment for over 40 years. She had pictured meeting Elaine again, sitting together, finally talking about everything that went wrong. She never got that chance with her sister. But meeting us felt like a gift she hadn't dared to hope for. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. My mother reached out and touched Ruth's knee gently. My mother introduced herself properly, explaining that she was Elaine's only child. Ruth nodded and said she knew. She had kept track from a distance, through old friends and occasional searches. She knew about my mother's marriage, her divorce, even about me. She said she had wanted to reach out so many times but was afraid of being rejected again. The fear of another silence had paralyzed her for years. I asked Ruth about the original fight, the one that started everything. She closed her eyes briefly, as if reaching back through decades of memory. She said it happened at their father's funeral. Emotions were raw, and words were spoken carelessly. She had criticized Elaine for not visiting their father enough in his final months. It was unfair, Ruth admitted. Elaine had been dealing with her own struggles. But grief made people say cruel things. Ruth said she tried to apologize immediately, but Elaine wouldn't listen. The silence started that very day and never lifted. Ruth wrote letters for years, hoping one would finally break through. She moved to Minnesota, raised her family, and built a life. But there was always a hole where her sister should have been. She learned to live with the absence, but she never stopped feeling it. My mother pulled the envelope from her purse. Her hands were trembling as she explained what it was. Ruth stared at the familiar handwriting on the front, and tears began streaming down her face. She didn't open it immediately. She held it against her chest like something precious and fragile. She asked if Elaine had written it recently. My mother shook her head and explained it was from 2010. Ruth finally opened the envelope. She read the letter slowly, her lips moving slightly with each word. When she finished, she looked up at us with an expression I will never forget. Grief and relief and love all tangled together. She said Elaine had apologized. After all those years, her sister had finally said she was sorry. It didn't matter that the letter was never sent. The words existed. That was enough. We spent the next 3 hours talking. Ruth told us stories about Grandma Elaine as a young woman. Adventurous, stubborn, fiercely loyal. She described their childhood in Wisconsin, the games they played, the secrets they shared. My mother listened with wide eyes, hearing about a version of her mother she had never known. I watched them both, feeling like I was witnessing something rare and important. Ruth showed us a photograph from 1965. 2 young women stood arm in arm, laughing at something outside the frame. Elaine and Ruth, before everything fell apart. They looked so happy, so unaware of the decades of silence that awaited them. My mother asked if she could have a copy of the photograph. Ruth said she could keep the original. She had lived with it long enough. Before we left, Ruth asked if she could write to us, not just once, but regularly, the way she used to write to Elaine. My mother said yes immediately, her voice thick with emotion. I said yes too. The thought of building a relationship with this woman, of filling in the gaps that Grandma's silence had created, felt like honoring something that should have happened long ago. Ruth hugged us both tightly. The flight home was quiet. My mother stared out the window for most of it, lost in thought. I didn't push her to talk. Some experiences need time to settle before words can capture them. But halfway through the flight, she turned to me and said something I wasn't expecting. She said she finally understood why Grandma was the way she was. Guarded, critical, afraid of getting too close. She explained that Grandma had built walls after losing Ruth. Pushing people away became a habit, a way to protect herself from more loss. It didn't excuse how she treated my mother, but it explained it. Understanding the source of someone's pain doesn't erase the hurt they caused, but it can soften the anger. My mother said she felt lighter, like she had set down a weight she didn't know she was carrying. Over the following months, letters traveled between our homes and Ruth's house in Minnesota. She wrote about her garden, her grandchildren, her memories of a sister she never stopped loving. My mother wrote back about her life, filling in the years Ruth had missed. I added my own letters sometimes, sharing small moments and asking questions about family history. A bridge was being built, one envelope at a time. Ruth came to visit us that summer. She stayed in my mother's guest room for a week, and we cooked Grandma Elaine's recipes together. Ruth remembered some of them from their childhood and added details we had never known. Which dish was their mother's favorite? Which one Elaine invented herself? The kitchen felt full in a way it never had before. 3 generations of women, connected across decades of silence and loss. On Ruth's last night with us, we sat on the porch as the sun set. She held my mother's hand on one side and mine on the other. She said Elaine would have been proud of us for finding her. She said family isn't just about blood. It's about the choice to keep reaching out, even when it's hard. I thought about that birthday dinner, the note I passed to my mother, and how one small act of courage had led us here. A year passed after Ruth's visit, and our lives had changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. My mother smiled more easily now. She called me just to talk, not because she needed something or wanted to criticize. We had dinner together every week, sometimes cooking Grandma's recipes, sometimes trying new ones. The sharp edges between us had softened into something gentler. I finally felt like I had the mother I had always wanted. Ruth and I developed our own relationship, separate from my mother. We talked on the phone every Sunday evening. She told me about her week, her garden, her neighbors who checked on her daily. I told her about my job, my small apartment, the ordinary details of my life. She listened like everything I said mattered. I had never had a grandparent who made me feel so seen. Ruth filled a space I hadn't known was empty. Then one October morning, Ruth called on a Wednesday instead of Sunday. Her voice sounded tired, thinner than usual. She said she had been to the doctor and received some news. They found something in her lungs, something that shouldn't be there. She was going in for more tests, but she wanted me to know first. My stomach dropped as I listened. I asked her how she was feeling. She said scared but peaceful. I called my mother immediately after hanging up. She answered on the first ring, as if she had been waiting. When I told her about Ruth, there was a long silence on the other end. Then she said we needed to go to Minnesota. Not in a few weeks, not when we had more information. Now. I agreed without hesitation. Some moments in life don't wait for convenient timing. This was one of them. We flew out 3 days later. Ruth met us at her door again, but she looked different this time. Smaller somehow, more fragile. The spark in her eyes was still there, but it flickered instead of glowing steady. She hugged us both for a long time, longer than before. When she finally let go, she said she was glad we came. She said there were things she wanted to tell us while she still could. That first evening, Ruth sat us down in her living room with tea and photo albums. She said she had been thinking about legacy lately, about what she would leave behind. She didn't have much money or property to pass on, but she had stories, memories, pieces of history that would disappear when she was gone. She wanted to give them to us while she still had the chance. She opened an album from the 1950s. Inside were photographs of her parents, young and hopeful, standing in front of a farmhouse in Wisconsin. She told us about their struggles during hard economic times, how they nearly lost everything twice but held on through sheer determination. She talked about the values they instilled: hard work, loyalty, the importance of family above all else. Her voice was steady but soft. Ruth turned to a photograph of herself and Elaine as teenagers. They wore matching dresses their mother had sewn by hand. Ruth explained that their mother made all their clothes back then, staying up late after long days of farm work. She taught both daughters to sew, to cook, to manage a household. Those skills weren't just practical. They were acts of love passed down through generations. I thought of Grandma teaching me to cook. My mother asked Ruth about their father, the man whose funeral had sparked the terrible fight. Ruth's expression grew complicated. She said their father was a difficult man, loving but demanding. He expected perfection and showed disappointment openly when his daughters fell short. Both she and Elaine carried wounds from his criticism. Looking back, Ruth wondered if that's why Elaine became so defensive, so quick to shut people out. The conversation shifted to forgiveness. Ruth said she had spent years angry at Elaine for the silence, but somewhere along the way, the anger transformed into sadness, and then into acceptance. She realized that holding on to resentment only hurt herself. Forgiving Elaine didn't mean the pain wasn't real. It meant choosing peace over bitterness. She looked at my mother when she said this, and something unspoken passed between them. My mother's eyes filled with tears. She told Ruth that she had struggled with forgiveness too, forgiving Grandma for being so critical, forgiving herself for not being a better daughter. Ruth took her hand and said forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a practice, something you choose again and again, especially on the hard days. The words settled over us like a blessing. I knew they weren't just for my mother. The test results came back 3 days into our visit. Ruth sat us down with the same calm she had shown from the beginning. The news wasn't good. The cancer had spread further than the doctors hoped. Treatment was possible but would be difficult, and the prognosis remained uncertain. Ruth said she wanted to fight, but she also wanted to be realistic. She asked us to help her hope without pretending. We stayed in Minnesota for 2 weeks. My mother and I took turns accompanying Ruth to appointments, cooking meals, sitting with her during the long, quiet afternoons. We fell into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and sacred. Ruth told more stories, shared more photographs, wrote down recipes she had never documented before. She was building an archive of herself, piece by piece, for us to keep. One evening, Ruth gave me a small wooden box. Inside were letters, not the ones from Grandma's attic, but letters Ruth had written to me over the past year and never sent. She said she wrote them on days when she missed me especially, when she wanted to say things that felt too big for a phone call. She had planned to give them to me eventually. Now seemed like the right time. I read the letters that night in Ruth's guest room. They were filled with observations, memories, hopes for my future. She wrote about watching me become more confident, more willing to speak my truth. She said I reminded her of Elaine in the best ways, determined, passionate, capable of great love even when it scared me. She said she was proud to know me. I cried until the pages were spotted with tears. Before we left Minnesota, Ruth asked us to make her a promise. She wanted us to keep reaching out, keep building bridges, keep choosing connection over silence. She said the worst thing about her estrangement from Elaine was all the lost time. She didn't want us to repeat that mistake with anyone in our lives. We promised. It felt like a sacred vow, witnessed by generations of women who came before us. The flight home was different from the first time. There was heaviness now, the weight of uncertainty about what the coming months would bring, but there was also gratitude. We had found Ruth in time. We had given her Grandma's letter. We had built something real and lasting, even if the time was shorter than we wanted. Some gifts are measured in depth, not duration. My mother and I talked for hours during that flight. She told me things she had never shared before, her fears about aging, her regrets about past relationships, her hopes for who she still wanted to become. I listened without judgment. We had become equals somewhere along the way. 2 women navigating life together instead of mother and daughter locked in old patterns. The shift felt permanent. Ruth started treatment the following month. We called her every day, sent care packages filled with her favorite things, arranged for neighbors to check on her regularly. My mother even flew out twice on her own, spending long weekends keeping Ruth company. Watching my mother care for someone so tenderly transformed how I saw her. The criticism and coldness that once defined her had made room for warmth. I began to understand that healing isn't linear. It spirals and circles back, revealing new layers when you least expect them. Finding Ruth had healed something in my mother that I couldn't reach. Losing Grandma with so much unresolved had healed when we delivered her letter. And my own relationship with my mother kept healing each time we chose openness over old defenses. The birthday dinner had started something that was still unfolding. Ruth fought for 8 months. She endured treatments that left her exhausted, phone calls where her voice was barely a whisper, and days when hope felt impossible to hold. But she never stopped reaching out. Even on her worst days, she sent short messages, a photograph of her garden, a memory she wanted to share, a simple reminder that she was thinking of us. Her determination to stay connected humbled me in ways I still struggle to articulate. My mother flew to Minnesota 5 more times during those months. Each visit, she came back quieter, more reflective. She told me about sitting with Ruth during treatments, holding her hand through the difficult hours, reading aloud from books Ruth loved. My mother discovered a capacity for tenderness I had never witnessed before. Caring for Ruth was teaching her something she had never learned: how to show up fully for someone without walls. I visited Ruth twice during that time. The first visit, she was still herself, tired but sharp, full of stories and questions about my life. We spent an afternoon looking through her recipe collection, and she told me which ones to keep and which ones she had never perfected. She laughed at her own failures in the kitchen, and the sound filled me with desperate gratitude. I wanted to bottle that laugh and keep it forever. The second visit was harder. Ruth had declined significantly in just 6 weeks. She slept most of the day and spoke in fragments when she was awake. But she recognized me immediately when I walked into her room. She reached for my hand and held it against her cheek. She said my name twice, like she was memorizing how it sounded. I told her I loved her. She smiled and closed her eyes. Ruth passed away on a Tuesday in June, with her daughter by her side. My mother and I weren't there for the final moment, but we had said our goodbyes the week before. Her daughter called us that evening, her voice thick with grief, but also peace. She said Ruth had talked about us constantly in her final days. She said we had given her mother a gift she had waited decades to receive: connection to her sister, even after death. The funeral was small and beautiful. We flew to Minnesota one last time and sat in a church filled with people who had loved Ruth. Her grandchildren spoke about her kindness, her patience, her famous apple pie. Neighbors shared stories about her generosity. And then my mother stood up, surprising everyone, including herself. She walked to the podium and unfolded a piece of paper with shaking hands. My mother spoke about finding Ruth's letters in the attic, about the decades of silence that had separated 2 sisters. She talked about delivering Grandma Elaine's unsent apology and watching Ruth read it for the first time. She said Ruth had taught her that it's never too late to reach out, never too late to say you're sorry, never too late to choose love over pride. Her voice broke several times, but she kept going. When she finished, the church was silent. Then Ruth's daughter stood and embraced my mother tightly. Other family members followed, introducing themselves, thanking us for coming, asking questions about Elaine. We had become part of their family story, just as they had become part of ours. The walls that had separated our families for generations were finally, fully, coming down. It felt like healing on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. After the funeral, Ruth's daughter gave us a box she had prepared. Inside were things Ruth had set aside specifically for us: her favorite cookbook, a quilt she had made decades ago, photographs we had never seen, and letters she had written to Grandma Elaine over the years that were returned unopened. She said Ruth wanted us to have them. She said Ruth considered us family in every way that mattered. We drove to the airport that evening carrying pieces of Ruth's life in our luggage. My mother was quiet during the drive, staring out at the Minnesota landscape Ruth had loved so much. When we reached the terminal, she turned to me and said something unexpected. She said she wanted to be different now. She said watching Ruth die had shown her how little time we actually have. She didn't want to waste any more of it. I asked her what she meant. She said she wanted to stop criticizing, stop holding back, stop protecting herself at the cost of real connection. She said Ruth had lived with regret about Elaine for over 40 years. My mother didn't want to live with regrets about me. Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest, in a place I had guarded for most of my life. I felt the last of my defenses begin to crumble. The months after Ruth's death were surprisingly tender. My mother called me more often, and the conversations were different. She asked about my feelings, my dreams, my fears. She shared her own vulnerabilities in ways she never had before. We laughed together about small things and cried together about Ruth. The distance that had defined our relationship was shrinking steadily, replaced by something warmer and more honest. On what would have been Ruth's 82nd birthday, we cooked her favorite meal together in my mother's kitchen. We used her recipe for roasted chicken, different from Grandma Elaine's, but equally delicious. We set an extra place at the table and lit a candle for her. My mother raised her glass and toasted to Ruth, to second chances, to the courage it takes to reach across silence. I echoed her words and meant every one. That night, we looked through the box Ruth had left us. My mother read some of the returned letters aloud, her voice catching on Ruth's hopeful words that had gone unanswered for so long. It was painful to hear, but also necessary. We were witnessing the cost of silence, the price of pride sustained too long. I understood in a new way why my mother was working so hard to change. She had seen where the alternative led. I started writing letters of my own after that. Not just to distant relatives, but to friends I had lost touch with, colleagues I had misunderstood, even an ex-boyfriend I had ended things badly with years ago. Most people responded with surprise and gratitude. A few didn't respond at all, but the act of reaching out felt important, regardless of the outcome. Ruth had taught me that the trying matters more than the result. My mother and I established new traditions over the following year. Sunday dinners became sacred. We cooked together, talked openly, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence. She came to my apartment and I went to her house, alternating weekly. The rhythm felt natural now, nothing like the obligatory visits of my childhood. We had built something new together, something that honored the past without being trapped by it. On the anniversary of that first birthday dinner, the one where my mother mocked my cooking and I passed her the note, we recreated the meal. Same recipes, same table setting, same candles. But everything else was different. My mother complimented each dish genuinely. She told me she was proud of who I had become. She thanked me for not giving up on her. I told her I loved her, and for the first time, the words came easily. I think about Ruth often, about her patience, her faith, her refusal to stop reaching out even when every letter went unanswered. She waited over 40 years for reconciliation and almost didn't get it. But she did finally, in the last chapter of her life. She met us. She read Elaine's apology. She died knowing she was loved by family she thought she had lost forever. Her story could have ended so differently. Mine almost ended differently, too. If I hadn't written that note, if I hadn't found the courage to say what I needed to say, my mother and I might have continued in our painful pattern forever. Finding Ruth's letters in the attic might never have happened. The healing that followed would have remained locked away, a possibility never realized. One small act of bravery changed the entire trajectory of our relationship. I'm 35 now, and I finally understand what it means to choose family. It's not about obligation or guilt or performing love you don't feel. It's about showing up honestly, speaking your truth gently, and staying open even when it's terrifying. It's about writing letters that might never be answered, and cooking meals that might be criticized. It's about believing that connection is worth the risk, always. That's what Ruth taught me. That's what my mother is still teaching me. And that's what I'll carry forward.